All right, well, Blogging Heads viewers, we have a real treat today. Michael Crowley, senior editor from the New Republic. You may have seen his work in the New York Times Magazine, Gentleman's Quarterly, and, of course, Reader's Digest. Thanks for doing BHTV.
Thanks, Eli. It's good to be here.
How you doing today?
Oh, I'm pretty good. I spent this morning, reading the national newspapers, which seem, at least in my little world, to be largely about the New Republic today. For reasons we can get into later, but it's always interesting when you get up in the morning papers or writing about you and your colleagues in great depth. So it's not the doldrums of August around here right now, unfortunately.
There was a lot of coverage of the Andrew Bacevich piece. Oh, wait a second. No, joking around.
We'll get to that.
We will discuss that later. But let's talk about Iraq first.
Well, I just want to say, Eli, because I'm new to Blogging Heads and I don't have the massive reputation and stature that you do. I mean, for God's sake, you've been over there. You blogged. I think didn't you actually blog like in Kevlar and a helmet from the Green Zone?
Briefly, I didn't really. I mean, it was I didn't.
All right.
I showed the audience my stuff. Yes.
Well, I just always felt that if I had the opportunity to do a Blogging Heads, that I would want to roll out some kind of prop. So I looked around my apartment to try to find the most absurd thing I had, and the only thing I was able to find is, for some reason, I have this doll. This is Tim the Enchanter from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and fans of the movie may recall that Tim's kind of great memorable line is when when the knights all find him and he shrieks at them, "Yes, I can help you find the Holy Grail." And Eli, I'm hoping that today on Blogging Heads you're going to help me find the Holy Grail of success in Iraq, which
you're looking for the pony.
That was an incredibly forced and convoluted way of segueing into this subject, but I did want to use the prop and also point out that for non-ideological reasons, I like to think, but pragmatic reasons, I don't see how this is anything but how this ends but in anything but complete failure, humiliation, and anarchy. And I know that you are a little more rosy about it. So I'm willing to hear your arguments, but I come to them with a healthy skepticism.
Understood. Well, let's define our terms first.
Okay.
I think at this point we can say success is avoiding a competitive confessional genocide, which is to say that you can avoid
That's
what
a low standard.
I know it's a fairly low standard, but because
terms.
I think that's what happens when the troops leave, I'm willing to sort of say that's one component of this, and I think success is also an election in 2009 or late 2008, provincial elections before then, and the continued sort of progress of the Iraqi institutions, which are not there yet, but if they don't collapse and they keep getting better, albeit marginally better, because I've been very upfront about how bad the military and the security services are and how there's such a great risk of infiltration and corruption, that those would be the measures of success, which I think are attainable. Instant, overnight Jeffersonian democracy, impossible, don't expect it. And I'll go one further. This current government in the Iraqi parliament probably will not reach any political compact while they're in power. I say that reluctantly, though I will say that there are terrorists who have been elected in 2005 who probably should be arrested in order to see progress in those other two areas. So you will get no chance of any progress whatsoever on the political accord that so many Democrats and I think many Republicans are hoping to hear about from Ryan Crocker and General Petraeus when they come and give their briefing in September. And I don't think that Crocker or Petraeus are going to tell you that there is any potential progress. I mean, you just have too many people, not everyone, there's a lot of very good people who've been elected, but there's too many people, particularly on the Sunni side, though also on the Shia side, less so with the Kurds, too many legislators that are really should be on trial at this point.
Well, okay. Well, we're going to zero in. I think we've agreed on the debate that's coming up in September that everyone's treating as this sort of D-Day, and so we won't keep it on this kind of highly abstract level for too long. But
if I could say one more thing. If I could say one more thing.
Yeah.
The reason that I think that success in what I said was in preventing competitive genocide and continuing progress with Iraqi institutions is possible is because in the areas where the surge has taken hold, there has been a night and day difference. That surge is not everywhere in Iraq, but where we have cleared and we're finally holding, there is remarkable progress. And also, I think that more so now on the Sunni side than we may see on the Shia side, you're seeing an alternative in the awakening fronts, which are not perfect, and an alternative to guys like Khalif al-Ayyan and the very misguided notion that ex-Baathists somehow spoke for Sunni Iraqis, which was very wrong.
But Eli, isn't the key point here that sure, in the places where we've surged and maxed out our troop forces, you can improve security, but we can't even sustain the surge past the spring, and the surge is only limited to certain areas, and while in those areas things may be getting better, there are other areas that have gotten worse, or there's reason to assume that the insurgents are regrouping and are going to start targeting other areas. So you can't even hold the ones that we've managed to lock down unless the Iraqi security forces really improve, and I don't see a tremendous amount of evidence for that. It's only we're only dealing with a pretty limited area of Baghdad, much less the country. So it just seems to me that you're pointing to a short-term boost that's totally unsustainable, and so therefore I'm sympathetic, I have to say, not for partisan ideological reasons, to the Democrats who are going to be saying in September, how many more times are you going to come asking us for 6 more months to make this work? And when this doesn't work, you're going to have some new plan that we have to give 6 to 12 months to work. And I think at some point those people really have the benefit of the doubt. And so I guess we should talk about the politics of September, I think. But just as a closing question to you, why? Okay. Where do you disagree with the reasoning that this is the absolute best it's going to get? It only involves limited areas, and we basically have to draw it down by spring or summer of next year, given the limitations on our military capacity and troop rotations.
Very good question, and let me answer it. First of all, there's an element of the surge which is less discussed, but let's just be honest. There's a dirty war going on right now with our new Iraqi allies against the Iranian network in Iraq. The more they're rolled up and detained and killed is better for the rest of Iraq, I think, because they are saboteurs and terrorists, and they help those elements. But also there's a war against Al-Qaeda, which we saw was won in the province of Anbar, where Al-Qaeda was very prevalent, and they had a base. They moved a lot of Al-Qaeda people moved to Baquba, and I'm saying that there are a finite number of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, contrary to Josh Micah Marshall and Juan Cole. This is not just a bunch of Sunnis who don't like the government. This is really Al-Qaeda. We should not forget that. While Al-Qaeda senior leadership doesn't make every decision in Iraq, it's not really an Iraqi organization. We just saw that exposed with the capture of a guy named Mashadani.
That's not what the New York Times and Michael Gordon said a couple weeks ago, and you may be right, but that article said that it was largely indigenous, that they get their money from within Iraq, and that there's very little leadership from outside of the country. But I'll defer to your expertise. I just wanted to interject that.
The leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq is a guy named Ayyub al-Masri, which means Ayyub the Egyptian. He fought with the Egyptian Special Forces. He became an associate of al-Zawahiri in Egypt, and he is the leader. Now, there are plenty of Iraqis who joined for whatever reason because of some sort of sickness that Al-Qaeda, but it is in many ways a foreign ideology. And how do we know that? When I was in Iraq, I talked to plenty of tribal sheikhs who were turning on them, and there are plenty of Iraqis who absolutely hate them. Why is that the case? It's because the areas that Al-Qaeda in Iraq took in 2006, when the strategy, and 2005 I should say, when the strategy was to sort of lighten the American footprint in Iraq, they turned them into, really worse than the Taliban in some ways. Some of the anecdotes that you're getting from people like Michael Yon are extraordinary. I mean, forcing parents to eat children. I mean, I'm saying these are things that he's been out there in the operation in Diyala and Bakuba.
Wait, they actually forced parents to eat
You got to
children?
read this piece by Michael Yon, and we'll link to it. But there was literally, they baked, I think, an 11-year-old alive and forced the parents to eat him. It's sadism. There have been other examples.
At a different point in TNR's history, I might say that I found that difficult to actually believe, but I probably don't want to get into arguments like that right now.
I'm crediting this with Michael Yon, who's with these troops and going to these areas.
I'll trust you on it.
Okay, no. I mean, I'm saying even if that's let's say that that's an exaggeration from villagers. I mean, I'm saying this is what an report. What we know is that the people who were forced to live under Al Qaeda in Iraq had to live as in not only constant terror and fear. Hence, so many of them have left, but also. It was a slave system, basically. I mean, there was no autonomy at all. I mean, I don't think any human. I'm saying this as I think that there's certain universal sort of truths about human nature. Nobody would want to live under this crazy system. Al Qaeda is not a popular organization. They were against these elections, which were enormously popular. So I think that there is an opportunity to destroy Al Qaeda in Iraq, and that is not to say that everybody in Al Qaeda, in fact, most people are foreigners, but the leadership of Al Qaeda in Iraq is foreign. Let me just offer one last response to that, and then I think since I've never been to Iraq and you have some leverage on me, whereas I've been to Capitol Hill and recently to talk to people about Iraq, so we could segue to the politics. But I would note that the Washington Post did that great long story maybe 2.5 weeks ago that kind of war-gamed an American withdrawal from Iraq, and it did not leave me particularly alarmed. I mean, one of the sort of consensus conclusions seemed to be that Al Qaeda, if it managed to linger over there, would be too bogged down, sort of fighting regional enemies or indigenous enemies, trying to kill Shiites and spending less time trying to kill Americans. That was a quote that I remember from the piece. I'm not sure who was making that contention, but it was someone pretty credible, and that a lot of the other horror scenarios wouldn't really play out. So maybe we'll put up a link to that for anyone who missed it, because I think we should put up a link to that. But I think that they were talking about, I remember that piece, and they were primarily talking about the notion that there was a view, especially among the Baker Hamilton Group experts last fall, that if there was a retreat, it might have to be a fighting retreat, because there's that one road out to Kuwait, which is where they would go. And that we may have really made it easier. We may not need a fighting retreat this time. But the horror of an Al-Qaeda potential for an Al-Qaeda safe haven, a country literally, at war with itself, more political refugees, more senseless torture and murder, less stability in the country that may have the second or third largest oil reserves in the world. Not to mention an opportunity for Iran to increase its hegemony. All of that will happen when we withdraw, which I think are awful consequences. It doesn't, and especially since I do think that it's possible to, sort of chart modest, and I want to stress the word modest progress with Iraqi institutions, and I'd like to see Americans there, and I think they will be there, by the way, for at least the next election.
I will say, and I want to talk, actually, maybe we can segue to this. I had this, I guess I've been in Washington long enough that I now get invited to these strange things like off-the-record luncheons with Republican senators who are, I guess, just trying to improve their relations with the media, and it's kind of funny because you go into this swanky restaurant and there are all these usual suspects from the media there, and you sit around. And so I did one of these a couple weeks ago, and a few bloggers linked to it when I wrote about it. And the senator, the conservative Republican senator who was there was, saying what you were just saying, which is that people aren't paying enough attention to the consequences. But I actually think that has now kind of become the cliche or the conventional wisdom in the debate, that no one's paying attention to the consequences, whereas in fact all anyone does now is talk about the consequences, like Iranian influence and the possibility of Al-Qaeda establishing camps, whereas I actually find, and I tried to press him on this unsuccessfully, I find that's actually driven out the conversation about the consequences of staying, which is to say the degree to which this is a recruiting tool, the sheer never mind for a moment the lives, the American and Iraqi lives lost, but the sheer amount of money we're spending on this, the opportunity costs, our inability to shore up, or the difficulties in shoring up our forces in Afghanistan, and to sort of menace the Pakistani tribal areas, which is a whole other can of worms. So that's my. But maybe, Eli, we should segue into the Capitol Hill politics, because I know we wanted to get into that. And why don't I just we'll put up a link to this blog item I wrote. It was not that long, and the truth is that this senator was sort of a mysterious experience talking to him, because he was saying things that I wasn't. Were kind of surprising to me. One thing he said that was not terribly surprising was that he doesn't see a circumstance where there would be a majority in the Senate for a binding change in our war approach, a veto-proof majority by the end of this year. He doesn't think that's possible. He thinks that Republican senators are going to hold firm when Petraeus and Crocker come up and issue their report in mid-September, which of course is the sort of D-Day that everyone's looking at right now. The thing that I thought was a little surprising was that he claimed that he expects the White House to announce a new strategy, a new shift in strategy around that time, which he suggested would involve a gradual drawdown, which would actually not be, I pressed him a little bit whether this would be sort of a symbolic, trivial drawdown of, maybe 20,000 troops over 6 or 9 months, and he made it sound like it would be much more, and almost something more like a kind of redeployment where we would focus on fighting Al-Qaeda. I'm not sure that is the kind of, and some bloggers pointed this out, I don't know if his talking points are up to date or what. It seemed a little weird, and I wonder what your take on that is, on what I guess let me put the question to you this way. Talk about the politics among Republicans. What signals you think the White House is going to send to try to keep its people in line, and how it's going to play out?
Okay, well, you got two views. I mean, we can sort of say there's the Grover Norquist view, which is that the Republicans going into 2008 need to have leave in the gerund form so they can sort of run as Nixon against McGovern, which is to say, we want peace with honor, we're leaving, we are in the process of leaving, but we're not going to, just accept dishonor and defeat the way the Democrats want to. That's the Grover view. And then I'd say that there's the Fred Kagan view, which is that for now we have an opportunity to actually make things a lot better in Iraq. It doesn't matter if what Republicans say about Iraq or what the White House says about Iraq so much as whether Iraq can turn around. And Iraq can turn around if al-Qaeda is defeated, if the Iranian network is defeated, if enough tribal sheikhs are willing to sort of make a compact and politically enter the process in a way that the people who were sort of brought in by the CIA and Lakhdar Brahimi and the UN, people have not on the Sunni side, and that there is quite a bit to fight for, and that the level of the troop level is sort of less important than the strategy that we're not going to allow for these neighborhoods to sort of get under control of the rival kind of confessional gangs. And that's the Kagan view, and I think the Kagan view won, because President Bush gave this very stirring speech during the defense authorization debate about al-Qaeda being in Iraq. He seemed to very much come out saying, I'm going to be sticking with Petraeus. And I think that the Grover view, or what might be the cont'd view, and the kind of the Doug Lute view of, we better have some plan to show that we're leaving, lost. Now, I might add, though it's going to sound strange, Bush prior to the surge would always say, we're going to leave at the moment, like, when the Iraqis stand up, we'll stand down. And that there was always this view that, we wanted to sort of accelerate the Iraqification, which proved, I think, to be such a disaster. So in many ways, the mistake that the Democrats in 2006, remember, Nancy Pelosi asked her Get Out of Iraq Now caucus to stop, gathering signatures and so forth, or, she distanced herself from the Withdrawal Now non-binding resolutions a year ago. And in 2006, they didn't say they wanted to just get out of Iraq. They said we need a new change of strategy. I think that there really was a new change of strategy, but the politics changed in America, where people just got so sick of the war.
Right. Well. So do you think that I think it's pretty clear that Republicans are not going to Democrats are not going to have be able to override presidential vetoes in either the House or Senate. So a lot of this is kind of symbolic. But I think that on the Senate side, and by the way, Democrats think the symbolism is very important, because I think the key to I think the thrust of the Democratic strategy right now, I know this is how a lot of the leading anti-war activists on whom I've done a little bit of reporting in the last couple of weeks feel, is that the key is to kind of is optics, political pressure, keep forcing Republicans to cast really difficult votes to defend what they see as an indefensible position. So, and that you end the war finally by the bottom falling out, the Republicans going to the White House and telling Bush, we can't be with you anymore. It's not that they're going to get veto-proof majorities. But all that said, I do think that if they can get enough votes to break a filibuster in the Senate, that is a very would be a very symbolically important milestone come September. I think that they're kind of approaching that point, but I don't think they're actually going to reach it. Do you have any sense? Do you have any different sense on that? Do you think that Democrats are going to be able to get 60+ votes?
I don't think the Democrats want to end the war. I think the Democrats want to keep having as many votes as possible on the war that vulnerable Republicans up in 2008 have to vote against. Hence, this is why I think that. Because we were talking about this before, but there were some compromise amendments that could have gotten more Republicans, but particularly in the Senate, there was this outreach from Warner and Lugar. If you remember, in the beginning of July, they all said we need a new change, of course, but they stayed with the non-binding. I mean, with the hard and fast binding deadline of April, and that's not that the Republicans are not going to go for that. And they don't. Right. And also, that's not even realistic. I mean, that's just a rhetorical flourish that you put on a bill that you don't think is going to pass. So, I think they want to get Lugar. They want to get like Norm Coleman to keep voting for the war, so that Al Franken can say, "This guy keeps voting for the war. Why don't you elect someone like me? I don't like the war."
I think that's a little cynical, Eli. I mean, I don't dismiss it out of hand, but isn't it possible that there's actually some convergence between the strategy of trying to put Republicans in an impossible position and ending the war, which is to say that I think there was a lot of opposition among anti-war Democrats to Harry Reid pulled the defense authorization bill a few weeks ago, right, rather than allow a vote on basically an endorsement of the Baker-Hamilton Commission, right? I have that right so far, yeah? And one of the arguments against this was, if you give these Republicans who are sort of on the fence a vote like that lets them kind of release some steam, gives them something they can go home and tell their constituents they've done, that is in effect prolonging the war without actually getting us any nearer to ending the war or really substantially changing the strategy. And I think I'm sympathetic as a pragmatic political strategy. I think I'm sympathetic to that argument, which is to say that it doesn't necessarily mean you're being a big cynic and saying the war is good for us and we want it to go on. You're saying we actually have a better chance of ending the war if we prevent some of this nibbling around the margins in the short term and focus the debate not on Baker-Hamilton, this amendment that they killed in the House last week, I think, was just for the Pentagon to send up a plan on how they would withdraw, but it didn't really begin any withdrawal or set any timeline. Again, what good does that do beyond giving Republicans cover to sustain a prolonged occupation? So I think that you're putting an overly cynical spin on it. And just the one last point let me make one more point, okay, Eli, which is that I've talked to people in the kind of big umbrella anti-war coalition. They call themselves Americans Against Escalation in Iraq. And a lot of their energy and funding, if I understand correctly, comes from MoveOn.org. Right. And, something that they that I've heard sort of come up in their conversations is the tension between wanting to end the war and winning seats in the Congress or holding seats in the Congress. And I've just sort of heard this I've heard, and the point is that their stated goal is to get the war over, to get us out of Iraq, to get Republicans to vote to end the war. And I've heard a couple of people say, hey, wait a second, if we convince Susan Collins, the Maine Republican moderate senator, who is one of their chief targets, if we convince her to flip on the war and vote for withdrawal, doesn't that make her re-election a lot easier? And in a way, they are kind of working at cross purposes, and it's an interesting tension. And I think the response of the leaders of those groups is, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it, at least among the anti-war activists. There may, Rahm Emanuel may feel differently. But I've heard that some of these anti-war activists, they certainly don't feel like it's all a political game. And move on, incidentally, we can talk about this in a minute. They're the ones who are now accused of being sellouts, who are too partisan and in line with the Democrats. Yeah. But even they realize that this is not necessarily in the party's long-term interest. So
it's like the Bolsheviks versus the Mensheviks. Anyway, a little joke for you, Mr. Crowley. Hey, listen. Here's why I'm cynical about the Democrats. Okay, because I don't think that the Democrats themselves, out of conviction, believe that we should just betray the Iraqi people to the forces of Qaeda, Quds force, and Iranians. And
I think that's a better point. Go ahead. Yeah.
I just don't think that this generation of DLC Democrats who kind of got over who under President Clinton full-heartedly endorsed non-UN sanctioned intervention in Kosovo and sort of understood the moral case against Saddam Hussein, the human rights case against him, not to mention the serious non-proliferation case that the Clinton administration made, that the Democratic Party and the leadership, at least of the Democratic Party, is not where the base is. And that the reason for their conversion, in many ways, was because they couldn't sustain it politically in terms of where their party is, and particularly going into a primary year, that, they had to somehow sort of reflect, what does Coase call it? The Cossacks. Yes, amazing. My people remember the Cossacks as, Russian pillagers on horseback. But anyway, again,
they don't call themselves
but the people
the Cossacks,
they crashed the gate. Now, Kucinich, Barbara Lee, Woolsey, I would argue, probably Ted Kennedy, certainly Senator Byrd. These are people who really do believe that the war, they were against it from the beginning. They really do want to end the war. But I don't think that that's the case for the leadership in the Senate. I don't think that's the case for Harry Reid. It might be for Nancy Pelosi. She's from San Francisco, but I don't think Steny Hoyer wants to end the war in that way. And I think that deep down they recognize that it's better. It's great politics for them to look like they want to end the war, but then never quite get there, and then target the vulnerable Republicans. And it's going to be very much harder for a Republican to openly contradict and then deal with their base, General Petraeus, and openly sort of contradict this great general who's been praised by talk radio and everything like that. So it's hard. Norm Coleman, you should have seen the kind of pressure he was getting from Hugh Hewitt and folks like that when he was talking about maybe going to the anti-war side, and same goes for Brownback. So
I'll concede to you that there may be some moderate Democrats who think that we should stay and don't mind seeing Republicans take the heat for it. But I doubt there are many who actually want to prolong the war for political gain. But Eli, I think we're following a little behind our schedule, so maybe we should move on. I think
yearly coast, it happened.
Yearly coast. So you don't want to talk about Basevich, or did we already kind of cover that, or do you want to just kind of quickly raise your objection?
Let me just quickly say
because I want an excuse to link to this wonderful article in our magazine, and I'll give you a moment on it.
Hey, first of all, Andrew Basevich is a very talented writer, and his writing, especially after he lost his son, who was in Iraq, was really compelling, and even for someone like myself, who is an advocate for maybe you call him the Victory Caucus, it certainly gave moment of pause. He's a very serious guy, but I thought that the article sort of was wrong in the sense that.
Do you want to just say in maybe 2 sentences what the article said?
Okay, yes. I think what the article said is that Petraeus is overrated, and he's just sort of another general who's come along, and that his idea of buying time through security for political reconciliation is bound to fail, in part because he's just paying off a new group of terrorists to go after worse terrorists. And my problem with that, at least the last part, and we won't dwell on it, is that Al-Qaeda really is a lot different than the 1920s brigade. The 1920s brigade really are Sunnis who were disaffected in some ways, and some of them are former Baathists, and they did some terrible things. But in the case of the Anbar Salvation Front and other Salvation Fronts, a lot of these are just sheikhs who really were, sort of making what they thought was a smart bet with Al-Qaeda, and now making a bet against Al-Qaeda. And they are a world of difference from Al-Qaeda, and to get rid of Al-Qaeda is necessary precondition. I would also argue getting rid of the Iranian influence and getting rid of, most of the Mahdi army and probably even Muqtada Sadr are probably necessary preconditions that have nothing to do with sort of time as much as that you can't have those people and those sorts of institutions in the country and then have political progress. And so my problem with his piece was along those lines, which is that you need to take any opportunity you can to get Al-Qaeda. You need to take any opportunity you can to try to split the Mahdi army and the Shiites from embracing sort of death cults on either side.
I don't dismiss your points out of hand. I would just say that he had this analogy to the police arming the Bloods to take on the Crips, and sooner or later,
that was the analogy.
The gangs turn their guns on the cops, and I just think that history is rife with ominous examples of factional groups that are armed by governments, including ours, and those weapons and that organization that we help to establish and to distribute comes back and bites us in rather nasty fashion. I would just one tangential point that he kind of touches on, and I would love to read a good piece on this. I've seen kind of smaller things, but I think there's kind of a great long piece for someone to do. Is just how many of our, he talks about the number of generals who have already come through Iraq and kind of screwed up really badly,
yeah.
And I think it's sort of amazing. Look, I'm not a military expert, and I have a lot of respect for people in the military, but it does amaze me how much incompetence has been demonstrated in the senior leadership of the military. I mean, going into this war, these guys seem like they could do no wrong. I mean, Kosovo was such a precision, flawless operation. I guess maybe with apologies to the Chinese embassy, but some of these generals who came through, and even Odierno, if you read Tom Ricks's book Fiasco. Odierno is now Petraeus' deputy, and I find that kind of distressing because Ricks portrays Odierno as a complete incompetent, and I think that there must be something wrong with our system that these guys are getting kicked up the ladder. But maybe we should move off
Odierno
of
did
Iraq.
catch Saddam, by the way.
I'm sorry?
He caught Saddam, which was a big deal.
He caught Saddam. I haven't caught Saddam lately, so I'll grant him that.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Cossacks, and maybe I'll just open the conversation. So this yearly conversation convention.
Well, if I could just say one more thing on the Basevich thing. It's not arming the Bloods against the Crips. It's arming like the shopkeepers against the Bloods and the Crips. And I think that's where he misses the point. And the other thing I would say is that he sort of puts Norman Schwarzkopf. Norman Schwarzkopf did not decide that we couldn't go and knock off Saddam in '91. That was
he says, just so viewers know. He kind of disses Schwarzkopf and says history has shown him to be a failure. That Basevich says Schwarzkopf didn't take out the Republican Guard and didn't go to Baghdad, and now he's kind of a joke.
No, Schwarzkopf is a great general. I mean, I don't think that's fair. I think he's right. I mean, Casey and Sanchez, were not. I think that their strategy failed. And there's no kind of. I don't think there's appreciation as much in the piece, though he does sort of touch on it on how different what Petraeus is doing. He
gets at this. The guy who has gotten off scot-free in this country, I mean, who has just unbelievably gotten off the hook is Tommy Franks, who I think has a lot to answer for, and as far as I can tell is on the lecture circuit, making huge amounts of money, did a best-selling book, got one of those preposterous White House medals, I think, but that we could spend a long time talking on that. I think we should move on, Eli, or we're going to
let's move to the coast.
Let me
Yearly
open the Yearly Coast, which I think a lot of Blogging Heads viewers will be familiar with, and this is the second annual convention held by the Daily, sponsored by the Daily Coast website, which has become, I think it was our friend Garance at the American Prospect who I may be wrong about this, who kind of wisely pointed out that it's just become the Yearly Coast convention last year was this sort of fascinating coming out for the blogosphere where columnists and reporters got to go see these people in the flesh for the first time and size up what they look like and how they behave offline. Now it's just kind of becoming this all-purpose sort of liberal convention for progressives and liberals and party interest groups. And it's kind of the equivalent of this CPAC convention that takes place every year, where all the conservatives come to Washington and frolic. And this year distinguished by Ann Coulter's reference to John Edwards as an F-A-G-G-O-T. Are there two T's? I'm having my Dan Quayle moment. Are there two T's in that word, Eli? Help me. I think there's only one.
How am I supposed to know that?
I just wanted to say, just introduce, to kind of get this stirred up for a minute. And I think you'll enjoy this because I think you had a kind of amazing outburst directed at the netroots on Blogging Heads a couple months ago. And I almost typed out an email to you saying that I thought you'd gone a little too far, even though I'm someone who has sometimes criticized the excesses of what I see in the liberal blog sphere. But you might enjoy Ben Smith of the Politico, who has also appeared on Blogging Heads. His assessment from Yearly Coast recently was that the blogosphere, the influence of the liberal blogs in the Democratic primaries is a shadow of what it was in 2004. That Democratic presidential candidates have started treating the blogs like any other special interest, reaching the conclusion that liberal bloggers are more a community than an ideological movement, more like, say, the Armenian American community than NARAL. And as someone who recently wrote about the Armenian genocide resolution, let me say that is not, the Armenians are a tough bunch. So he's saying basically politicians are co-opting bloggers, that they put them on their payroll, that they buy them off with lavish parties and free hors d'oeuvres and kind of snicker behind their backs. And I think that might be slightly over. Ben's great. I think that might be slightly overstating it. I still think that the liberal blogs really have a big impact on mainstream news coverage, and that the sort of memes and storylines and facts that they introduce can be really important, especially within a Democratic primary, in a way that, it's hard to gauge these things, but certainly I think more than the Armenian Americans, and maybe even more than NARAL, in part because when you look at those other interest groups, Democrats largely agree on a lot of issues that that a group like NARAL would care about, or even at the AFL-CIO debate last night, it was kind of a race to see who could bash China the most. Whereas the differences come in more on questions like the rhetoric these candidates are using on foreign policy in Iraq and Iran.
Right.
So, but I think your take, Eli, is that these guys are what, the root of all evil, and they're leading us to defeat and destruction?
The root of all evil. I wouldn't say that. I mean, listen.
I'm just trying to goad you.
Yes. Yeah. No. You can goad me. Listen. I think to give them credit, the netroots and the liberal blogs, which there was an interesting taxonomy that was Jonathan Chait put out in your magazine a few months ago, which was actually a really smart piece, and I think people should read it to understand. Though the posture of the piece was so coming from the New Republic. Anyway, it was like really conceding a lot of the argument, and it was still, you can't please them. If I was the editor of the New Republic, Mike Crowley, I would have done our Netroots issue with like a double-barreled lead story, one by Leon Wilsailtier, one by Leon and one by Marty. That's why I would have done it. And so and then the big debate. Question
that would
mark.
Have provoked debate.
Useful idiots or moral idiots? That's how I would have done it. Anyway, but that's me. That's why I'm not the editor of the New Republic.
What in a line is the problem? Why can't you just tune out? Why can't you just tune out the liberal blogs? Why?
Well, I love reading it.
Why can't you just ignore them?
I'm sorry. I'm kidding. And I joke around and kid. Anyway, let me. I will say this: there are a lot of very smart writers that I totally disagree with in that world, like this Digby person. She's a very good writer. And there are a lot of and I think that they're wrong, and I think that they're tendentious, and I don't think that I think they've been suckered by certain sort of politically convenient storylines about the deception for the war, the Scooter Libby stuff, and I think they get a lot of stuff wrong. But that as a fellow writer, they're doing commentary. A lot of it's pretty brash. So in that respect, you have to sort of deal with them. And I think that what they've become are the kosher cops of the Democratic Party, which is to say that they kind of are what we used to do, which is that they say who's being democratic enough, who's being progressive enough, and who's not being progressive enough, and they are most relevant in terms of like that freshman congressman and how is he going to vote on something? And he's got to factor in what these blogs and the netroots are going to say about it, about him. Now, I also think that they're going to be much less relevant on a national scale as soon as the Democrats pick their nominee, because I don't think that you can't please on the war everybody in the netroots and still get enough of a constituency to win a general election. And I think that the Democrats will court them as they're doing now, and then, kind of cauterize them, which once they get the nominee in, they've got to run against a Republican.
Well, just to go back to yearly coats and also to kind of raise another issue we wanted to talk about. I mean,
but they're not the middle, as Marcos said. They're the left.
Well, they're partisan. I mean, this is the thing that Chait got into. But I think their defining quality is partisanship. Although they're clearly not centrist either. I mean, that's a complicated. I think there's a longer debate there that I don't want to kind of dip a toe into and then not be able to really follow through on. But I think it's a little more complicated. But you had mentioned the presidential nominee and the nominating process. I was struck by how generally successful Hillary Clinton seemed to be out at the Yearly Coast Convention. I mean, she was loathed by this crowd not very long ago, and she's gradually winning them over. Marcos was very happy that she had dispatched her spokesman Howard Wolfson to defend his website from Bill O'Reilly, who's been making a kind of a bizarre crusade. I mean, I was watching O'Reilly the other night, and the whole thing was so weird. O'Reilly had Dennis Miller on as a guest, and he threw up this picture that he had found somewhere on Coast. I think must have been buried in the diaries somewhere, of like a Photoshop of Bush maybe kind of seeming to have sex with a goat or something. And him and Dennis Miller were just riffing away on it, and it was incredibly weird. Eli, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, you were just hypnotized by the majesty of my observation.
I love Dennis Miller. You ever listen to his radio show?
Whose? O'Reilly's?
No, Dennis Miller's show.
No, I find him totally unbearable, and I thought the whole segment was so incredibly
You find him unbearable?
bizarre. Yeah, and O'Reilly was trying to get Dennis Miller to denounce this photo of Bush with the goat. And it was actually very funny because it kind of blew up in O'Reilly's face. He was trying to get Dennis Miller to express outrage and talk about the loony left. And Miller kept making sheep noises and these double entendres about Bush, how engaging in bestiality. And O'Reilly was getting kind of upset. Anyway, I digress. The point is that Hillary sent her spokesman out. He defended Coase on O'Reilly. Hillary went to Yearly Coase. She did a pretty good job. I saw that Petraeus, who is who's a blogger who really kind of disdains the centrist Washington establishment, said the other day that he found Hillary to be incredibly likable and warm in person, which I was struck by. I mean, she's winning these people over, and this goes to my larger contention, Eli, that Hillary Clinton is clearly going to be the next president of the United States, and that she's going to be the nominee. She's killing in the debates. She's winning over her old critics. And the Republicans are saddled with this disastrous war that the public hates, and they don't stand a chance. What do you say to that?
There are a lot of people who dislike Hillary, but that said, I think that she's she's the most professional politician. She's got the most professional organization. I think Hillary is the prototypical example of the Democrat, as I said earlier, that doesn't really want to leave Iraq precipitously. She's already said she wants to let troops go to, the Kurdish regions, and she's warned about a precipitous withdrawal and what it would mean. So I thought, you wrote an article a few months ago about how Hillary the Hawk, which was right on. I thought that was absolutely right. I have even heard that she...
I should say, in case people didn't read it, and in the interest of minor self-promotion, I argued that Hillary's war vote... I kind of made a case that the assumption that her war vote was entirely based on polling and calculation may be somewhat misguided, and that although clearly there was enormous political pressure at that moment to support the war, and I established the not terribly shocking news that her pollster Mark Penn was very big on Democrats kind of being hawkish and establishing their national security credentials, that if you look back at her record over the prior decade or so and look at her tenure in the White House, she turns out to have been very active as First Lady, even in foreign policy debates in the White House, which is something I think people didn't realize, and was consistently urging intervention, use of American force, and almost was kind of a proto-neocon in the sense of supporting the use of American force to spread our values and democracy. But that's another debate. I'm sorry to jump in, but you were saying
no, it was a great piece.
Yeah.
So, listen, I think that the netroots are, and the Coast crowd, and that there's a whole group of young bloggers who love John Edwards, are allowing themselves to be hoodwinked and bamboozled, to use the old Malcolm X phrase.
Which
is to say that they're being pandered to. They're being pandered to. That John Edwards, do you think John Edwards had a real conversion? I remember covering him in 2003 and 2004, and he was one of the most vocal advocates for all the sort of ideas of robust American power. And now he gets out of it because he puts out this laughable story that, like, I was tricked by the neo. I mean, that
I think, Eli, people give him credit for admitting that he was wrong, and differentiate that between someone like Hillary, who can't bring herself to repudiate her vote. Now, I think there's an argument...
Right, but they should respect Hillary more, because at least Hillary's not going to totally pander to them. And
they don't see it as a matter of pandering, but I guess you think they're being hoodwinked.
Let me put it like this: I'm not a social conservative, okay? But if I was a social conservative, I would appreciate Giuliani more than I would appreciate Romney. Because at least in Giuliani's case, he's being straight with me, and Romney's just telling me everything I want to hear. How do I know that he's not going to change his mind once he gets elected? Like, how do I know he's not going to be another read-my-lips conservative like Bush the First?
But you would presumably be a supporter of McCain, because it seems to me likely that Romney, at least, is going to make a break for it on the war at some point. Giuliani, maybe not, but I mean, McCain is the guy who's going to see it through. McCain is going to find the Holy Grail, right, Eli?
McCain, I like McCain a lot, and I respect him, but I don't think he's going to win the nomination, and I hate to say this, but the optics of it, he just doesn't look as vital as he did 8 years ago, and I think Giuliani kind of covers a lot of that territory, and depending on what Fred Thompson does, I think Fred Thompson will be a hawk throughout the campaign. And I'm not so sure, though I think you're right, that there's a danger that Romney could defect on the war, though I think it's going to be very hard at this point to defect if you're a Republican, because I think that don't underestimate Petraeus. Petraeus is going to wow them. I think he's really a brilliant guy, and I think that his arguments are going to be much sharper than those of his critics. And if he's in a hearing situation, I think I think Levin would be loath to contradict him. I mean, I think that it's going to be very hard to be in that hearing and sort of say, how do you know that, General? How do we know you're not lying? Because he's not Bush, and he, at least in the past, he has. I think his job is to triangulate the White House and Congress, and in that triangulation, which I think he will be successful in, he's going to make it very hard for Republicans to defect from Petraeus. It's easy for Republicans now, I think, to defect from Bush. It's going to be hard for them to defect from Petraeus.
All right. Well, should we wrap up with just a couple minutes of more frivolous banter before we call it a day?
We don't. I mean, like this was covered by an earlier Blogging Heads, the Beauchamp thing.
Yeah. Right. Oh yeah.
I mean, I don't. I don't know what to say.
Why don't you tell the world your take on it? Because I think I'm going to be. Circumspect for out of a desire not to spend my time.
All right.
Having to respond to the responses to my response.
Okay, my take on it is this guy's account of what life was like in the war did not square with what I've heard from other soldiers, and at times didn't seem plausible, and at times more often seemed very exaggerated. That said, and I really think that I think the Weekly Standard on the war in the last 3 months has found its groove back. I mean, like, I think that Crystal is really his arguments for staying and for going with Petraeus have been really spot on. And I've written for both the Standard and the New Republic, and I think that both publications are excellent. So I don't want to kind of get into that, but it was unfair to lump in the New Republic with the Nation. I mean, New Republic is not the Nation by any stretch. They've written plenty of stories that have been, given a very different view of what not only the war is like, but what the view of soldiers are like. Anything by Lawrence Kaplan. So I thought that was unfair to sort of make. I mean, I think that there is something like that going on at the Nation and in other places. And the other thing I would say is that I think that and you guys didn't really do this as much, but some on the sort of left side of the blogosphere want to make this Beauchamp guy a kind of martyr, and that the military is trying to shut him up, and the conservatives just don't want to hear the truth. And I don't think that that's really it. I mean, I think that was a key detail that he got wrong. Kuwait was presumably before the war. And, this guy sounds like, to be honest with you, a creep. So I don't think that this is a matter of, you just don't want to hear the real story of the war, because I think that actually most soldiers would say that this stuff really wasn't very plausible. And Black 5, a site that's been on this, is really... those guys are military guys, so they know. I think that they're going to have a better claim about military stuff than Matt Iglesias.
That's true. I'll just say a couple things. One is that we've talked to a lot of military people, and there are different perspectives from people with military experience. I don't think it's a unanimous reaction, but I don't claim to have military expertise. But it's not a unanimous reaction from people with military experience, although different people emphasize different points and quibble with different things.
Yeah. And I want to say one more thing which is that blogs get to ask lots of questions, okay? And they don't necessarily have to have any, you know what I'm saying? And newspapers like the New York Sun and magazines like the New Republic have to report things out, and it's a different kind of process. And it's never a perfect process, but I mean, just to assume that this is done out of bad faith, I think, is completely off. And I know Frank, and I know you and other people there, and it's just that to me just seems like it's an unfair criticism.
Well, that's just enough. I mean, I don't want to get into the weeds of it today, but on the larger point, people have seen in that piece a kind of vitriolic anti-war, anti-troop agenda, which just doesn't exist around here. I mean, you've already kind of made the points for me, but this has been a very strange experience because the defining thing about the New Republic and the internet in the last few years has been the kind of constant bashing we've taken from the netroots and the anti-war left, which called us the Lieberman Weekly and the New Republicans and all this sort of thing.
Can
because
you
the
come
magazines...
back home, Michael Crowley? Seriously.
I'm sorry?
They're never going to love you. They're never going to love you. The netroots. They're never going to love you.
Well, look.
They're always going to hate you.
We're not
Marcos,
loved.
you just did this whole thing. Marcos is not going to link to the New Republic. Come on.
Look, I'm not whining about it. I'm just making the point that it's been very strange all of a sudden to be totally reviled on the right. If I didn't hate the Washington cliche about being attacked on both sides, meaning you're doing something right, I might invoke it. Although I appreciate that I very much appreciate some of the liberal blogs that I think have made important points that were down to our defense.
Yeah.
But my point, Eli, is
this is all in good fun.
My point, Eli, is that I understand. But my point, Eli, is that we're as you know, the New Republic is not a rabidly anti-war magazine, and we've actually done a lot of really good reporting on things the military has done well. Lawrence Kaplan did a great, memorable piece. I think it was a sort of definitive piece on Tal Afar, the counterinsurgency there, and some of the heroic efforts by military men there, which I would recommend to people. And just on a smaller personal point, I can understand why you would say that Beauchamp sounds like a creep. I've met him, but I don't know him personally. I will say that anyone who's met his wife, she is just absolutely the sweetest person that I know. I mean, just such an incredibly good-hearted, warm, sweet person. So I want to just submit that for the record, Mr. Chairman, and I yield my time.
Well, listen. It's if any conservatives watch Blogging Heads TV, they let me write for them occasionally. Come on, this is not the Nation. All right, right. It's just not. It's not the same. It's not the same sort of thing. And it's just I was a foreign correspondent, and I filed foreign dispatches for you guys. It's a very difficult thing. You're trusting the journalist. The journalist only has his reputation, and that's 99.9% of the time is going to be enough to guarantee that you're getting verifiable and true facts. In that 0.1% of the time, when you just deal with someone who is a sort of psychopath who makes things up and abuses that trust, you acknowledge it, you move on, you apologize, and you keep doing good journalism. And the New Republic does great journalism.
I'm not
and
sure
so does the Weekly Standard, by the way. I think the Weekly Standard does great journalism. I don't want to pick a side
I'm not
there.
sure. I just want to say at this point that's an accurate characterization of what happened. I mean,
I'm not saying it isn't accurate. I'm not saying. By the way, I don't know.
If you were saying this is a psychopath who abused trust and so forth, I mean, that's not. That's. I don't have reason to believe that.
Okay, no. And I want to make something very clear. I want to say I don't. There is this story in the Weekly Standard that we know about. Whether he recanted it or not, I haven't seen it on the record yet. So we're sort of waiting. I mean, I think both sides in this, the Weekly Standard and the New Republic, are very confident in their reporting. We have to sort of to wait and see. But even I don't want to say so. So let's not judge. I don't have all the information. I have not done the work that you guys have done to re-report it. I haven't done the work on the Army side that they say disproves it. So let's just sort of leave it at that. Is that fair? I hope.
Sure. Yeah. So do you want to? So do we have time? We're kind of up.
Oh yeah, we have a little bit. We have a little bit of time, and can we end on a lighter note?
Sure. I think we have to be quick, but let's get out on a light note.
All right. What do you want to do? Because I'm a Michael Crowley fan. I like the iPods article, but I also, if you want to talk about beefs with writers,
right?
Which is better for you, Crichton or the iPod?
Well. I don't know what you mean by better. I mean, maybe you should explain quickly what you're talking about.
Well, these are two things in that Michael wrote. I loved it was over a year ago. Michael wrote this great piece about how hard it was because Michael and I both collect music, and I have a lot of records, and you have a lot of CDs and stuff. And now with the era of the iPod, it's almost like all this time that we spent finding this very obscure, excellent music is sort of you can just get it in one download, and it makes us I kind of all my friends who get all this great music with no effort at all. It's sort of it makes you wonder, why did I spend all this time going to flea markets and finding these obscure?
It's the death of the rock snob was my shorthand for it.
Yeah. So so anyway, I just want to say that in a weird way, it was that piece got sent around by everybody. Everybody read that piece. I remember that. It was a huge thing, and I, at the time, remember reading it and sort of being like, yes, I'm in the sort of side of people who do spend a lot of time and considerably more money collecting music. But now, after kind of moving to Cairo, coming back from Cairo, kind of being on the go, moving apartments, my record collection has become, in many ways, significantly pared down, and most of my music collection is on my computer and on my iPod, and there's some great sites now where you can I can download exactly the kind of stuff that I like. And instead of going to some record shop in Manhattan or something and spending a lot of money on it.
I really miss the kind of ritual of going to record stores and hunting around. Yeah. I mean, there's still some that exist, but they're kind of dying off. But I'm starting to come around. I mean, maybe I was being a little bit of a, I was trying to kind of clinging to the past and resisting progress, which on the whole is a good thing. And I have to say that the one innovation is the ability to go back and find old videos on YouTube is completely awesome, and I spend huge amounts of time doing it. Recently, I found REM appearing on David Letterman in 1983, playing
awesome.
Radio Free Europe, and Letterman came out and interviewed REM at the end and said, "So you guys are from Athens, Georgia, huh?" And he said something like, and Mike Mills, the bassist, said, "Yeah, Herschel Walker." And I think you got to be of a certain age to have followed all that, but it was just incredibly hilarious reference. Herschel Walker was the big USFL star running back.
And a former Dallas Cowboy.
So I'm coming around. It was interesting writing that because I was sort of, lamenting the death of the rock snob and set myself up somewhat, hyperbolically as a rock snob whose kind of primacy was threatened. But, then I was hearing from real rock snobs who were saying, if you were actually a rock snob, you wouldn't listen to an iPod at all. You wouldn't listen to CDs. You would only listen to vinyl. I mean, Eli, you're the real rock snob here. because you actually are a vinyl man, and I never really was.
Well, I'm more of a jazz, soul, rap, salsa snob. But I love and the rock that I like is the kind of rock that rock snobs totally hate and think is not really rock. Like, I'm a Doobie Brothers fan, and I like Steely Dan. And if you like Steely Dan, it's like immediately
you were trying to turn me on to.
Yes,
it never worked.
Yes, exactly. Like if you like Steely Dan, all punk nation hates you. Steely Dan is the anti-punk, and I
stick by your guns, man. I'm for that. I think you have quirky tastes are cool. I think we probably need to wrap up.
We do need to wrap it up
without me taking any shots at my old friend Michael Crichton. Although I will point out the absurdity that from my whole encounter with the man, I still have several copies of his book. So if anyone wants to write into me, I will send you. You know, if you pay for the shipping, you can have basically Crichton's entire paperback library, because I need to get them off my shelf. And anyone who doesn't know what we're talking about,
you have Airframe?
Can just Google. What's that?
Yes. By the way, just Blind Edge viewers,
have Airframe.
Michael Crichton and Michael Crowley are in a beef.
I have Airframe, Eli, if you want it.
Writers' beef. Okay. Okay.
All right. So good luck in helping us find the Holy Grail. I really hope we do.
You watch. Okay. All right.
Great to talk to you, Eli.
Hey, great talking to you. Thanks a lot.
Okay, bye.